Today I'm going to be going through some of metal's worst albums ever. And just full disclosure, I completely ripped this idea off from Classic Album Review. He's got an amazing channel. He doesn't need a shout out from me. His channel is doing ridiculously well. You beautiful, bold bastard. I'll leave a link in the description for his video anyway. I'm sure most of you have probably seen it anyway. However, my video is going to be somewhat different. We all know those lists of metal albums that are terrible, and I'm sure that you can predict some of the albums that you're going to be hearing on this video. However, I found as I was going through these lists that there were actually quite a few of these albums that I'm in defense of. Don't worry, there are a lot of these that I genuinely don't like, for all of you negative shits out there. But there are a couple of these albums that I'm actually going to be defending, so this could be quite a fun video, I think. Let's start out with a very obvious one. Metallica, Saint Anger. It's a terrible album. I can't defend this one. I am not a Saint Anger apologist. If we were talking about Load, that might be something different because there's quite a lot of the tracks on that album that I actually enjoy, but Saint Anger, not so. This album is legendary for its terrible production, which when you consider it was pretty much the same team that did the Black Album, which is widely regarded as one of the greatest produced albums of all time, a production that in fact stands up incredibly well to this day. It's kind of laughable. However, I also think that people wouldn't be talking so much about the bad production if the songs were any damn good. And Justice for All, for example, is also known for its bad production, but those songs are also fantastic. So although it's mentioned, it's more of a footnote as opposed to the major event. Opening track Frantic has some really cool moments, but it's so bloated, it just goes on so long. Saint Anger, the title track itself, I remember hearing this for the first time and actually kind of digging it. It was the heaviest they'd been in a very long time, and there were moments on that song I thought were great. The main riff in Some Kind of Monster is fantastic, and The Unnamed Feeling is actually a really good song, but the rest of the album pretty much sucks. I don't think I've ever gotten through this album in one listen. I've never listened to this album from front to back, ever. Even when it first came out. It's just so bloated, so boring, so uninspired. Of course, we've all seen the documentary. The stock riffs, that was a terrible Lars. The stock riff, it's not happening. I've spoken about my love for Metallica many times on this channel, but I cannot defend this album. It's truly dreadful. I could have mentioned Lulu, but I don't even consider that a Metallica album, and I don't think I've ever actually heard more than a couple of tracks. It's just unbearable. But Saint Anger, first pick, terrible album. Next album on my list is Supercharger by Machine Head. Once again, like Metallica, I'm a Machine Head fan, and they've done some incredible albums. Rob Flynn's guitar work, his riffs, his guitar tone are always insanely satisfying to my ears. But this is not a good album. That's not to say that there's not good moments on it, because there are. Bulldozer is an incredible tune. In fact, if you listen to their Hell Alive album, I can't remember when that came out, but when they kick into Bulldozer live, that's an insanely good song, an insanely good live track. Crashing Around You is a great song. All in Your Head is another one. But a lot of this album just kind of, it's not what you expect from Machine Head. And I've got no problem with bands experimenting, but this was them firmly getting on the nu metal train, which they started with The Burning Red, which I think is a great album and a very underrated album. I think for a lot of these albums, the proof is in the non-listening. A lot of these albums, like many people, I remember putting them on for the first time, thought they were okay, and then I guess I just never really went back to them, and that's what I find with Supercharger. I've returned to it a few times. As I mentioned, a couple of great tracks, but a lot of stuff that's just meh. I don't think it's as bad as people say, but it's certainly not a great album. Next pick is Cold Lake by Celtic Frost. Now, this is by far the album that I'm least familiar with out of all the albums that I've got on this week's list. However, I have listened to it a few times over the last couple of days. It's not a great album, but I think it gets a way more hate than it deserves. There are some kind of, is it Petty Obsession? I thought was kind of an okay song. Interestingly enough, this album is not available on Spotify because Tom G. Warrior, the band leader of Celtic Frost, sorry, I'm not looking at the camera, I'm going through a bunch of thorns at the moment, much like these albums. Metaphor. He actually distances himself from this album as well, which is never a good sign. This is essentially a sellout album. This was the band kind of trying to capitalise on the glam rock era. We're getting there, people. We're getting there. Why did I go this way? There are some moments on this that I think are all right, but it was quite interesting because the only way I could hear this album was on YouTube. And some of the comments were quite funny. A lot of people saying it's an incredibly underrated album. It's certainly not as bad as I was expecting it to be. But somebody said, this is what a sexually repressed Dave Mustaine would sound like. That was kind of an apt description, I thought, to be fair. So, I mean, it's not a great album by any means, but from what I heard, it was actually kind of more palatable to my ears than I was expecting. I've got to go somewhere else. This is just insane. What am I doing? Next up is an album that I'm actually going to defend, and this is actually a hardcore album. Well, kind of, because I do love my hardcore. I keep meaning to represent hardcore in this channel more and more, and my top 10 hardcore albums and bands is going to be coming out at some point, I assure you, for those of you who've been asking, because quite a few of you have. But my pick for this one is Cro-Mag's Alpha Omega. And I actually really enjoy this album. This is an incredibly underrated album. Now, this is arguably not a hardcore album. This is full-on crossover, very much bringing in thrash elements. But this is, I think it's a fucking great album. Some of the lyrics on it and the songs are just absolutely fantastic. Eyes of Tomorrow, See the Signs. Of course, Apocalypse Now is one of the greatest Cro-Mag songs ever written. Now, if we were talking about the next album, Near Death Experience, that would be a different matter. That's not a great album at all. But Alpha Omega is a fucking great Cro-Mag's album. Highly recommend that you check it out if you haven't. Definitely not a hardcore album per se, but it's a great crossover album. And in my opinion, it has some of the best songs on it. It's nowhere close to Age of Quarrel, I'm not saying that, but it's a great album. And like I said, it's worth it for Apocalypse Now alone. Incredible track. Next up, we have Elude Divinum Insanus by Morbid Angel. There's no way I couldn't include this album, because this is always on these kind of lists. Now, this is one of those albums that I do think actually gets hated unnecessarily. Is it a good album? Not really. But it's not a terrible album. Of course, they experimented with a lot of industrial elements on this, and it didn't really pay off. But I'll be honest, I Am Morbid, I kind of like that song. Maybe that's not a popular thing to say, I don't know, but I actually kind of like that song a lot. I think it's kind of it's a funny song, I think. Morbid Angel are, of course, one of the greatest death metal bands of all time. And they're also a band that I appreciate more and more the older I get. When you actually go back and listen to a lot of their back catalogue, it's crazy how influential they were, not just in death metal, but in metal. They were always one of the bands that were experimenting and trying out new sounds and incorporating different elements into their music. And often it was done very successfully. This album, maybe not so much. But there are moments on it. Like I said, I actually think I Am Morbid is actually a pretty good song. But overall, I don't think it's a terrible album, but it's certainly not a good Morbid Angel album. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Next on my list, Slayer, Diabolus and Musica. I strongly disagree with this. Just checking my hair. My terrible hair. I actually think there are some great songs on this. Now, this would definitely see the band flirting with nu metal, but I still think there's some really heavy stuff on this. Slayer's least heavy album is still heavier than a lot of people's heaviest album, and I think that there's actually some really good songs on this. What's the fucking opening track? I can't remember. I ain't got a bloody signal at the moment. It's actually a really solid song. Then we've got, what is it, Death's Head and Stain of Mind, which are very much more in the nu metal category, but they are some, I think they're okay songs. There's a great track on here called Scrum, which I believe is actually about rugby. I think Kerry King wrote the riff to this in a hotel room after being in England for a while and watching rugby. And there's a real killer riff in that song. I don't listen to this album anywhere like I used to, but I remember when this first came out, I wasn't that put off by it. I thought there were some okay moments on it. And I think this is an album that is definitely better than people give it credit for. Is it a great Slayer album? No. Not at all, but there are moments of brilliance on it. And as I said earlier, Slayer at their least heavy is still heavier than most bands at their heaviest. So there's definitely some satisfying moments on it, and I don't think it deserves to be hated anywhere near as much as it is. Next up, we have Swan Song by Carcass. I actually enjoy a lot about this album. It's not my favourite Carcass album, but there are some great songs on this. Maybe it's because I'm a guitar player, and Bill Steer's riffs are just undeniable. I mean, it is essentially the same drum beat throughout the entire goddamn album, but some of the riffs are absolutely fantastic. You've got the opening track, Keep On Rotting in the Free World, which is a great song. Tomorrow Belongs to Nobody is fucking great. Black Star. Oh my God, the riff in that is just amazing. I think the first 6 songs on the album particularly are very strong, and the back half of the album, not so much so. But in my opinion, this is an album that gets way too much hate. Now, don't get me wrong, when this album first came out, I was very disappointed. Like so many people, Heartwork was an incredibly important album in my life, and it still is an incredible album to this day. So this was quite the disappointment following on from that. However, I didn't listen to this album for a long time. And over the last, I don't know, maybe over the last 10 years, maybe, I've kind of listened to it more and more. I've actually really started to appreciate it for what it is. I think it's a very underappreciated Carcass album. I don't think they have a bad album. This album goes much more into the death and roll kind of category. And I think it actually works really well. They've always been a band who've pretty much none of their albums are that similar to the next. And I think it's a strong album. Fuck it, I really enjoy the album, so I'm completely defending this one. Next album I wanted to talk about is Infestissimum, the second album by Ghost. I know from the comments that I get on my videos that a lot of you despise this band. I actually kind of enjoyed them. This is not a great album by any means, but I don't think it's a bad album. Monstrance Clock, the closing song, is truly glorious. That opener, you know, that closing, the closing chant of that song is just so much of a crowd participatory pleaser. But there's no denying that it's nowhere near as good as the debut, and it's nowhere near as good as the following album. Was it Meliora? Which is a banger of an album. I don't care what anybody says, that's a great album. So yes, I appreciate many of you don't like Ghost. I personally do enjoy them, but this is not a great album. I don't think it's a terrible album, but it's not a good one. I'm sorry, I'm getting, I've got all sorts of mud stuff going on here. It's the perils of doing these videos like this. In preparation for this video, I went through a lot of lists of people's most hated albums, and I chose the ones that I was most familiar with. A lot of these I was not surprised to find on the list. This one I kind of was. Slipknot, All Hope Is Gone. I knew that a lot of people maybe weren't so impressed with the Grey Chapter. But I was surprised to hear this on Terrible Albums. Now, I don't think this is a great Slipknot album, and in fact, I do remember at the time buying this album, listening to it, and kind of losing interest as I was losing to it. And it's definitely the one that I've not returned to much over the years. But terrible album? I'm not convinced of that. I mean, Psychosocial alone, not just an incredible Slipknot song, an incredible metal song, full stop. Such a damn good song. Having said that, I do kind of agree that this is probably one of their albums that have hit me less over the years. I'll be honest with Slipknot, I still enjoy a lot of the band, but after Vol 3, I kind of stopped listening to them with the vigour that I used to. Although We Are Not Your Kind, I thought was actually a really strong album. There was some great stuff on that. Birth of the Cool, oh goddamn. I included this one because I was just kind of surprised about how much hate this album got. Is it a good album? Not especially. Is it a terrible album? Not at all. It's not a terrible album. And my final album for this video, though I will happily do other videos if you require, is Iron Maiden with the X Factor. This is, of course, their first album with Blaze Bayley on vocals. Was it Virtual 11 they did after this with him as well? And this isn't a good album. I know it's very easy to shit on this period of the band. Lord of the Flies and Man on the Edge are decent enough songs. If you actually listen to a lot of the song structures in this album, it's actually typical Maiden affair, and it's actually pretty decent songs. And I know it's such an easy target, but Blaze Bayley, unfortunately, his voice just doesn't cut it. I've got nothing against him at all. He's done his own stuff, of course, with Wolfsbane, and he's got his solo stuff going on. He's definitely a huge presence and someone who's been doing this for a very long time. But there's no denying that his voice just doesn't work as well for Maiden. It's just, you know, the whole reason that they departed with Paul Di'Anno in the first place was that they needed somebody with that more powerful operatic sort of style, which they definitely got with Bruce Dickinson. And unfortunately, it really shows on this album. His voice just doesn't cut it. It is as simple as that. Not a bad voice, but not good for Maiden. If you could, you know, if you could imagine the chorus of Man on the Edge with Bruce singing it, you'd actually, it's classic Maiden. It is classic Maiden. But unfortunately, with Blaze Bayley, it really does just knock it down quite a bit. While there was potential for a great album here, it just doesn't work, unfortunately. I think also with Bruce Dickinson, he's a very opinionated guy, so I'm sure he has his hand in the writing process as well. So maybe Blaze wasn't so forthright in that side of things. I don't know, this is all just speculation, but yeah. Last pick, X Factor by Iron Maiden. Yeah, it's not a great album. Is it a terrible album? I wouldn't go that far either, but definitely one of the Iron Maiden albums I'm going to be listening to last. Sorry, Blaze, mate. Although you've achieved far more than I ever have in life. I'm walking around a field talking about other people's music. Though I am trying to defend it, if that means anything. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Make sure you like, make sure you subscribe. I've noticed that on a lot of my videos, the amount of views I'm getting and the amount of people who are subscribed is quite varied. So make sure if you haven't subscribed, subscribe already, because it really does help to boost the channel. Although to be fair, the channel's doing pretty goddamn good at the moment. It's crazy. And I'd like to thank all of you for that, for your continued viewership. I'd also like to apologise as well to anyone who's been commenting and I haven't had a chance to get back to. The sheer amount of comments I've been getting on some of these videos has been overwhelming, and it's been very difficult to keep up with. So, especially for long-time subscribers, because you guys are the ones who supported me in the first place. So, hope you know that you mean a lot to me. I promised I wouldn't cry. So that's another top 10 done. In case any of you aren't aware, there's currently a poll going on at the moment for my next album ranking, and at the moment Strapping Young Lad is quite clearly in the lead, so it looks like that's going to be my next album ranking, which I'm very much looking forward to. But there's still time for you guys to vote, so make sure you do that in the community tab. And yeah, I'm going to go and edit this video so I can get it out. I'll see you later. Bye bye bye.